Before we start, may I acknowledge the original owners of the land on which the university is based, their elders and their traditions, past, present, and emerging. And that should be true too for all of you who are based not just in Australia, but in other colonial outposts, including Leamington Spa. Today is a wonderful day, wonderful seminar, webinar tonight. Sean Breslin is going from the University of Warwick, is going to be talking about attitudes towards China from Europe. And he will be chaired by Jamie Riley from the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. Before I hand over to Jamie to introduce Sean and then take us away, can I ask you, when you're answering questions towards the end of this session, to please use the Q&A function in the Zoom down the bottom, and Jamie will read the questions out from there. Over to you, Jamie.
All right, thank you very much, David. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Sean Breslin. Sean is a professor of politics and international studies at the University of Warwick. He's I think a well-known scholar to, I'm sure, many people in the audience. Sean has been active in publishing and editing and really taking a leading role in Chinese politics, Chinese political economy, development studies, Chinese role in international development, and just a wide range of subjects. Some of his books that I think will be familiar to a lot of you. I'll include his earlier works on comparative government and politics, but after that, center-province relations in a reforming socialist state. Then later on, a really, I think, influential, interesting study of Mao. And more recently, a study on China and the global political economy are some of his books. His most recent book is China Risen, ? Studying Chinese global power. A really interesting study of looking at sort of not China rising, but rather the different aspects of the ways in which China's powers manifest in the world economy. Sean's been really active in a lot of different editing roles, as well as writing journal articles and pieces in edited volumes. He's a co-editor of the journal Pacific Review, and I think most intriguingly and promisingly for, I'm sure, his culinary options, at senior research fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. So without any further ado, I want to really express our appreciation to Professor Breslin for coming along and speaking with us today. I think we're looking forward to his presentation. So without further ado, Sean, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jamie. There are worse places to have fellowships than Milan. That is very true. Let me share the screen for you and just give a couple of contextual caveats. The first is I'm horribly jet lagged, so I apologize if I seem a little bit distant at times when I'm giving this talk. The second is that it says European narratives, but it really slips into UK narratives quite a lot of the time. I think there's a lot of what's happening in the UK that is representative of things that are happening in other European capitals, but clearly there is difference across the continent, and this is probably a bit too much about the UK and not enough about Europe given the title. And the third thing is I tried to be smart with the title, Changing Our Minds. This was an attempt to do a little riff on the idea that the soft power agenda, as it's often called, that has been pursued by the Chinese government to try and change the way that China is thought about and debated in other parts of the world, has actually had an impact, but not the impact that was intended. And in fact, that in many respects, it's the way in which this agenda has been promoted that has helped people shape not a more positive view of China, but in some cases a more skeptical or indeed outright negative view of China. Actually, in the UK, there's not been, I think, the intense discussion about Confucius Institutes that there has been in other parts of the world. But in places like Sweden, for example, we've now seen the closure of all the previously Hanban-funded institutes. In the UK, the Chinese ambassador, Liu Xiaoming, became very active in trying to get involved and put Chinese viewpoints across. And quite famously, in an interview on the Ma Show on a Sunday morning, was sort of hijacked by discussions and debates about Xinjiang that really left him in a quite difficult position, I think. But my attempt at a sort of smart way of talking about changing our minds sort of backfires, because you can't possibly explain the intensity of the shift that has taken place and how quickly it's taken place in the UK and more broadly in Europe, just on the backfiring of this soft power strategy. And I think it's just worth taking a second or two to remind ourselves the extent to which this change has occurred and how quickly so as well. And it's really from 2016 to 2019 that we see a quite dramatic shift in the way in which China is spoken about in the UK and parts of Europe, and also the consequences of China's rise for the continent. So this was a piece penned by George Osborne and Jim O'Neill, Lord O'Neill, in The Guardian in 2015, which I think really established the agenda of the Cameron government, with George Osborne really taking the lead. And it was this idea of an inevitable Chinese future, or Sino-centric future, or China-influenced future, that the UK just basically had to get on and try and live with, and not just live with, but benefit from. And I think there was a very strong competitive dynamic to what Osborne and O'Neill were saying here, on the basis that if the UK didn't manage to establish itself as China's best friend in Europe, then France or Germany would, and they would gain all the benefits of this growing economic engagement of the world and of Europe, and of this Chinese future. And at the bottom there, even as China's growth slows, it will continue to be a powerhouse for the global economy. The British government is pretty good in reaching out to academics and having conversations with them about their views of, in this case, China. But in this period, it was very difficult to say anything that might even be a little bit cautious about thinking about the future, because it was discounted. The inevitability of this future world order where China was a dominant player was so strong that any criticism was sort of battered aside. And Osborne really became the symbol of this agenda. This was a policy that was not driven by the diplomacy, not by the Foreign Commonwealth Office, but by the Treasury. And high point of it, I guess, was when Xi Jinping came to the UK, the golden era of UK relations with China, sharing a pint in the pub with Cameron, and all seemed to be set for a rosy future. So 2015-16, the real golden age. But things, as I say, change quite quickly. In 2021, the UK government produced an integrated report. This is meant to be bringing together not just foreign policy, but defence and development and so on and so forth, and referred to China as a systemic competitor. The European Commission, a couple of years earlier in 2019, had referred to China as a systemic rival. Both still noted the importance of China as a trade and investment partner, but really were placing the emphasis on the, if you like, world order type consequences of China's rise, which would not be beneficial for Europe. And what I've done here is just gone through and listed a few of the various reports that have come out over the last few years that either directly focus on China, as in the parliamentary reports from the Foreign Affairs Committee, Defence Committee and the Lords Committee, or have a very strong China element to them. The Foreign Affairs Committee report on relationships with autocracies wasn't strictly about China, but it sort of was. And we've seen a much more active think tank community investigating different types of the relationship, including with universities and educational and problems of economic insecurity and the urge to decouple from China, not just led by Civitas, but Civitas, which is a sort of conservative leaning think tank, has been quite influential in pushing that. And a couple of organizational changes as well. There is now a China working group within the Labour Foreign Policy Group, but perhaps most significantly, the China Research Group within the Conservative Party, a name that echoes the Europe Research Group quite clearly and quite deliberately, which has been very active, proactive in trying to bring the government to account on its policy towards China and push for new directions. Now, we have to be a little bit careful here because, of course, there isn't a single view. It's not as if there was nobody that was more skeptical or critical of China before 2019. And it's not as if there are people, all the more positive voices have disappeared. But there clearly has been a shift in emphasis and a shift in what I would call the dominant narrative. The consequences of China's rise are being discussed much more often than before, full stop. And skeptical and negative voices are louder and more frequently heard than ever before. I actually know a number of Chinese nationals in the UK who also feel that they are being treated rather differently than they were before, with some sort of questions about their loyalty. There is also a wider general interest in China amongst all branches of UK government. China is no longer just an issue that is there for trade or investment or the Foreign Office. It's now an issue that is permeating through all different parts of the government administration, and special training programs have been put on, for example, to try and help the people in these different ministries come to terms with how China might have some sort of relevance for them. But I guess perhaps, you know, the big headline is that the head of the MI6 says that China is now our biggest priority. I mean, it's a pretty blunt thing to say. And one of the things that I've found increasingly over the last year or two and find really quite troublesome is that there seems to be a process of dichotomization taking place as well. So it's very hard to hold sort of balanced or nuanced or unsure even positions on China in some sort of shade of grey. If you are critical of, I remember saying something about, I can't remember what it was, about China's COVID response that seemed to be critical. And the assumption was that I approved of everything that was being done in Britain and the United States in response to COVID, which seemed a little bit odd. And conversely, you know, if you say some positive things, then there is a possibility that you will be suspected of supporting Chinese policy in Xinjiang along the way. So I find this really actually quite difficult to deal with, this sort of push to extremes. So if the negative reaction to China's soft power agenda only takes us a tiny bit of the way, how can we explain the transition that has taken place and the speed that seems to have taken place, not just in the UK, but to different degrees in different parts of Europe as well? Now, part of me wonders whether it's something internal, that there's a crisis of confidence in the nature of the global liberal order in the UK and within Europe, a degree of declinism, perhaps accelerated by a lack of leadership under Trump and looking at what Trump was doing, or perhaps an acceptance of weakness, particularly after the global financial crisis, the moment that the EU sent a delegation to China to try and get funding for the Euro bailout was a moment, I think, when perceptions of power asymmetries sort of flipped. We can't, of course, escape the fact that people have changed. I don't know if Zhang Jinghan is on this webinar, whether he's listening or not, but he was convinced that if the Brexit vote had gone the other way and Cameron and Osborne hadn't had to stand down, then we would be in a very different world of UK relations now. And I think there is, you know, clearly some truth in that. People do matter. Simon MacDonald, who's the head of the diplomatic service from 2015 to 20, previously I think worked as a policy advisor to Gordon Brown as well, said that it was Theresa May who for the first time really placed the emphasis on security rather than just economics when it comes to relations with China. And I think what we clearly see when Cameron and Osborne stands down is that authority over China moves from the Treasury into other hands, Foreign Office, Cabinet Office. And I also wonder whether there's some form of overbalancing the extent to which Osborne was seen as being pro-China, supportive of China, co-tone to China, in some parts of the Conservative parties, perhaps led to a little bit of an overbalancing in reaction to that. Certainly, we have a more activist and organised parliament now in terms of speaking on China in the UK. Tom Tugendhat and the China Research Group I've already mentioned. Maybe that's a consequence of Brexit too, more confident backbenchers. But I'm a little bit wary of placing everything on simply leaders. Huawei was actually wooed and encouraged to invest in China, to invest in London by Boris Johnson when he was the mayor of London, in a competitive manner, actually, seeing what had happened to Huawei in Australia and the United States. There was a very proactive attempt to get Huawei to come to the UK. And he's called himself a Sinophile. So, you know, if leaders matter, and they obviously do to some extent, it's difficult to fully reconcile somebody who thinks of himself as being pro-China with a more questioning, cautious, skeptical, negative agenda. It's true that in other parts of Europe, leadership changes have had an impact too. We've already seen under Scholz a very clear attempt to establish a new direction in German policy towards China. But all that being said, if you take a step back from the country specifics and look at changes that are taking place or seem to be taking place across the continent in views of China, then the coincidence of these shifting views suggests that it's got to be more than just about individual leaders. So what else can we use to explain this shift? Well, maybe, I don't know, I've on my little notes here, I called it contagion, but perhaps contagion is the wrong word. Maybe it's learning. People have watched what's happened in changes in relations with China in other countries, and I think that has had an influence. What's happened in Australia-China relations hasn't gone unnoticed in Europe, for example. Trump's policy in the trade wars hasn't gone unnoticed. And as each European government, or those European governments that take a step towards a more questioning position on China takes place, then other European governments are looking at that and also perhaps following in step to an extent. So that's maybe one element. A story that you hear, I think, more clearly in the US than in Europe, but you are hearing over here, is this basic idea that the West got it wrong. The expectations of China's socialization into the liberal global order and domestic liberalization at home just simply haven't happened. And this actually points to perhaps not the West changing, but China changing, something we'll come back on to later. And even for those who had perhaps less lofty ambitions than changing China or socializing China, are looking at China after 20 years of being in the World Trade Organization and saying that the Chinese market remains as hard to penetrate as ever. And certainly when the Made in China 2025 agenda was being pushed, and also perhaps dual circulation, this idea that after all this time of one policy towards China, it's still really difficult to do business in China and make the profits and the gains and the advantages that people thought would come in the long term, are certainly having an impact in the commercial field, and that is having some sort of spillover, I think, into policy too. And then there's this idea of China increasingly being present in European backyards, and I use the word backyard here with some trepidation, because some of these backyards are quite distant ex-colonial backyards. But certainly Chinese investment and aid in Africa, and I think perhaps more significantly even the Caribbean, have had an impact on how some European governments have seen the consequences of China's rise. But perhaps more clearly than that, the nearer backyard, the way that the Belt and Road Initiative has promised some form of geo-economic change in Central and Eastern Europe, the creation of the 16, then 17, and now 16 plus 1 again process, in which China interacts with countries of most of the former Soviet bloc, but not all, has had set some alarm bells going in some parts of Europe, perhaps more for the EU as an actor and other European powers than the UK, but it's had an impact. There is now an idea that for the first time, China is not just distant and economic, it is closer and security related too. But I think most significantly, there's been a shift in the way that many European countries materially interact with China. Now, in the past, security issues have played a very minor role for Europe and Europeans, and there'd been a real focus on China as first a market and then also a producer. It was only really seen as a potential source of finance after the global financial crisis, and then it was largely seen as a good thing. But I mean, this slide in some respects tells us an awful lot, but in other respects leave a lot of questions unanswered. So basically, China is all but irrelevant as a source of inward investment and mergers and acquisitions for Europe until after the global financial crisis. And that big spike that we see in 14, 15 and 16 had a real significant impact, I think, on making people look at China in a different way. That the speed of that increase is really quite significant. And if we see where most of that investment goes to in that period, it's not actually to the countries in Central and Eastern Europe that at the end of the Belt and Road and then the 16+1 process. It's more towards the western part of the continent, and you can see there that the UK has received the most significant amount. Now, we have to insert a real voice of caution in this, because the speed of the increase is one thing. The overall cumulative consequence is something else. So this is Tom Tugendhat on the screen here. He's the guy who runs one of the runners of the China Research Group in the Conservative Party, being touted by some people as a future potential Conservative leader and Prime Minister. Gave a very effective and emotional speech in the House of Parliament after the evacuation of Afghanistan that drew a lot of attention. And there's quite a lot of interesting things on the China Research Group pages, and you can go along and see them, including this interview here with Sharad Coles, who is the head of the China-Britain Business Council, whose job it is to sort of encourage economic relations with China and investment. But these figures, if we pop back onto that screen, are almost meaningless if they're not in any form of comparison. And when you do put them in some form of comparison, as he says here, the total stock of Chinese investment is tiny, under £2 billion compared with 500 billion for US investment, north of 110 billion for Japanese investment. And last time I looked at the figures, I think the cumulative Chinese stock in the UK was something like 0.2% of the total foreign stock of ownership. And American investment and investment from the rest of Europe, and even India is more significant in the UK than it is from China. But that speed of the increase, I think, really did make a difference. And I think one of the reasons that it made such a difference is it combined with this message that seemed to be coming out of China, that there was now a much stronger intention to try and proactively shift economic geographies and indeed perhaps political geographies than ever before. And this shift in the material relationship, combining with the way in which these signals emanating from Beijing were met and received and interpreted within Europe, I think gave it some sort of multiplier effect. The Belt and Road there, again from the China Research Group, a political campaign to build a regional and global order with Chinese characteristics. The Made in China 2025 agenda was seen very much as a signal of China's future intent to take technological leadership, and if it couldn't be done domestically, to buy it, to really overtake Europe, overtake the West by getting hold of whatever it could from Europe and from the West. And then the final potential shift in cause of a shift, COVID. It certainly raised questions in the early days. There was a lot of negative talk about China in the early days of the COVID outbreak. The then Foreign Minister Dominic Raab said there was a need for a deep dive into relations with China, and we couldn't simply go back to business as usual. I think over the longer term, what COVID has done is probably given a stronger focus on supply chain vulnerabilities than perhaps was previously there. But I really see COVID as more a case of reinforcing and accelerating existing shifts in views and opinions, rather than actually being a cause of a change in mind. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a situation, I think, where Chinese investment and Chinese economic presence in Europe is increasingly being questioned. And the idea of what is a strategically important sector seems to shift depending on the country that is of origin that is seeking to invest in that sector. And the idea of what is a strategically important sector when it comes to China has become very, very broad. And the nature of the Chinese actor involved has become less relevant too. So even private Chinese actors doing things for commercial reasons can be viewed as being a potential problem in the long term, because of the idea that it will help China get bigger and stronger, and a bigger and stronger China must be problematic for Europe and the UK in the longer term. And I think I'm just going to float this out and see what people think about it, because I'm still playing around with this. I think in general, what's happened is there's been a conflation of a number of different things that are leading to the way that China is being viewed, perhaps not just in Europe either. And the first, and I think perhaps most significant, are things we don't like, we in inverted commas here. And there's nothing wrong with raising questions, issues that you don't like. But I think that there are things that are going on in China that make the nature of the Chinese political regime seem distasteful. And it's this that is primarily driving, I think, a lot of the framework through which people are looking at other dimensions of the relationship with China. So Xinjiang, for example, or Hong Kong, or perhaps the more general chipping away at freedoms and the way the legal system works. I mean, maybe here we have to think about what the threshold of dislike actually is, because normal day-to-day repression of freedoms and rights doesn't seem to have generated the same level of concern as what's happening in Xinjiang has, and the way that it has been reported. So the second is immediate and present threats and challenges. And here I think it's actually quite difficult to identify what those are. Restricting exports of key commodities might be an example. Sanctions, the tit-for-tat sanctions on Xinjiang, that might be an example. I think you've probably got more clear and present immediate examples in Australia. But what are the immediate and present threats and challenges to the UK or European governments that emanate from China at the moment? It's quite difficult to really identify what they are. And most of the emphasis seems to be on things that might become a threat and challenge in the future. And here perhaps we need to separate into two, where Chinese state actors have articulated their desire to use economic means to change current relationships in the future, on the one hand, so like the Belt and Road, and again, as I said, the Made in China 2025, maybe even dual circulation, so sort of responding to Chinese initiatives. But again, I think we're into a much more nebulous potential future that depends on what if sort of questions. Importing so much from China isn't necessarily an issue in itself, but what if in the future the trade relationship is politicized? What if in the future the CCP leans on Huawei? Then there's the fourth thing, is world order type challenges, which might include challenging norms and principles of governance, how human rights are defined and acted upon at the United Nations, for an example. And then also shifting economic geographies and flows of goods and money that could have political consequences too. And then finally, we return to this unspecific assumption that a rich and stronger China cannot be a good thing for the liberal world. And I think that in some respects, it's the top and the bottom of this, that sort of top and tail a lot of the way in which China is being looked at and perceived, and its future consequences understood. It's actually quite difficult to identify the real present threat now. But this general assumption that the what if perhaps isn't a what if, but more likely a when if. Does it matter? There has been a shift in policy, a shift in rhetoric, sorry, but has there been a massive shift in policy? When he was Foreign Minister, Dominic Raab was asked a couple of times to go in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and while he was generally sympathetic to the ideas that China did present more of a threat and a challenge than before, basically his argument was, well, where do we go? What do you want us to do? If someone has a better strategy, I'd like to hear it. You need to explain how that is going to take us any further forward. What do you want to do? Just sort of disengage from China? Perhaps more interestingly, despite all this talk about the danger of reliance on China, the trade relationship has actually increased, not least because of the pandemic and the sort of things that have been imported, like personal protective equipment during the pandemic. But imports shot up. China became the single biggest source of imports into the UK in 2021. And if you add onto this the economic downturns from COVID and also Brexit, as the rhetoric increases, as it heats up, there's actually been a quite significant increase in the importance of China as an economic partner, not only absolutely, but also relatively as well in relation to other key partners. That said, to wrap up, it's quite clear that the current Foreign Minister, Liz Truss, is one of the people who has a more sceptical view of China and has been seeking to find ways of combating or competing with China in terms of the spread of influence. This is a new investment arm. Bit of a shame that the UK government decided to get rid of, or to wrap the development into the Foreign Office, I think, and reduce its spending. But there you go, that's what she's saying at least. There has, as you well know, been a new emphasis on the importance of security relations in the region, not least through AUKUS. And actually, there have been some specific things that have taken place as a result of this integrated review of defence and foreign policy that I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk. What's interesting is that they've changed some of the directorates around. So India used to be in a separate one with Pakistan and North Africa and West Asia, almost defined by India's geopolitical competition with Pakistan. But India has now been shifted into the new Indo-Pacific directorate, and is perhaps an example of it being seen more in terms of its potential for alliances, stroke competitions in that part of the world rather than in South Asia. To finish, though, is a picture of a cake. And the reason that that's there is that in a conversation I had with somebody not too long ago, they asked if I thought Chinese policy towards China was cakeist. A new word for me. Is the UK and indeed other European countries trying to have their cake and eat it? How do you have a foreign policy towards China that is built on values, is built on your desire to spread a more liberal sort of agenda through the world, to respect human rights, whilst at the same time getting any of the economic advantages from China's rise that are going around? And even if you just focus on economics, how can you encourage the investment into the sort of places that you want it to go, but discourage it from going to the sort of places that you feel that it shouldn't be going to because of perhaps this unspecified agenda, concern about what Chinese agendas might be in the future? So is UK policy towards China cakeist? I think it probably is. But then again, in some respects, I think it probably has been since Hua Guofeng first came to the United Kingdom in 1979 and set in motion a new period of European relations with China, that have, I think, in large part grappled with this question of how do you get what you want, but not get the bits that you don't want. Okay, not too over time, so I will stop there and stop sharing, and let's see if that generates any sort of questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sean. I wasn't sure how to flag you on the time, so I'm really glad you came in right on schedule. It gives us plenty of time for a good conversation. I'm really looking forward to that. But I'm going to take the chair's liberty to start it off with a couple of sort of reactions and thoughts and comments posed as questions, or questions as comments, or something in the middle. Fascinating for us here in Australia to hear all of that. You may tell from my accent, I'm not an Australian, but I've been here for a while. And a colleague of mine, Jing Dong Yuan, and I are just doing a joint book project to look at Australia-China relations as we reach half a century. It'll be 50 years of diplomatic normalization at the end of the year for Australia and China. And as you know, things are not much more rosy here in Australia than they are there in the UK. So fascinating, I think, for those of us who've been watching it from down under to sort of get a bit of a comparative perspective on some of the relationship. And I think that's, I guess, one of the first things I'd put to you is a thought about that comparative. You mentioned a little bit about Europe. You didn't mention the sort of the 800-pound gorilla. I'll take the liberty of saying that since I'm an American, but the United States clearly has had a dramatic shift in its China policy as well. And I think I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about from a comparative perspective and to tell us a little bit of what you think we gained by thinking about how different countries have responded, not just across the continent, obviously, but variation around the world. Is it a uniform shift? Do we see contagion? Or surprisingly, where is their competition? I wrote a couple of years ago about China's involvement in Europe. And one of the things that China, I think, was very strategic in their economic statecraft was encouraging that competition. You referred to some of that with regards to London, the city in particular, being active in the financial sector. Is that gone? Is there no competition? Is there no seeking this out? Or is it a contagion effect? So looking more broadly about other countries, what do you see in contrast or similarity with the UK? I'm also really curious. I mean, you look, oftentimes my old advisor told me that Mike Mochizuki used to say, the world is overdetermined. There are many, many explanations for anything important. And certainly you listed a lot of the causes of what we've seen. But I'll throw two more at you, and I'm curious in your thoughts on this. First, it is, again, the American influence. Here in Australia, again, the American influence, I think, has been really important in thinking about explaining why in Australia we've had such a dramatic shift in our approach to China. Again, the timing is similar to the UK, but far more dramatic in terms of the consequences have been really severe, sort of. Certainly diplomatically, if not economically. And here, the U.S. influence is huge. To what extent do you think the U.S. and the shifts in the U.S. have been part of sort of explaining this dynamic we see in different countries around the world and this shifting narrative on China? Secondly, another possible factor, which you briefly flagged, but I've been really curious about, and I think is very relevant in the United States and certainly in Europe, and I think in Germany, which is as China climbs that ladder of sophistication and sort of development and the domestic political economy, China's not just making soccer balls and sneakers anymore, but indeed competing at the high end of manufacturing. They're challenging some of the European firms more directly in high-end manufacturing in Germany, for example. So to what extent is sort of domestic political economy within China and the shifting nature of the Chinese economy, not just protectionism or made in China, but more sophistication, a part of the explanation? So I'm just curious about that. And I guess two other things I'd throw at you before I open it up for everybody else. What should China do? You had Liu Xiaoming there, and I've met him briefly when he was ambassador in North Korea, actually in Pyongyang. But the diplomacy has been something that's been sort of a little ham-fisted, I think, in some cases. To what extent has the wolf warrior sort of rhetoric and label around that been part of the answer? And in that case, is that if China dials down the diplomatic language a little bit, how much would that be useful, either in the UK or elsewhere? And then I guess my last question is around the cost of all this. And you did flag this a little bit, but I'd love to hear more on your thoughts of this. In Australia, like in the UK, we have not seen the economic cost. Trade levels have remained pretty high. Investment has really collapsed, but there's many factors to explain that. So where are the costs of this? And is that where things start to turn around, when countries start to see the costs? I think here in Australia, we're starting to see, I think there's a potential with our latest election of a possible shift, at least some glimmers of hope and a change in rhetoric on China. But where does the change come from? Is it the costs get so high? So there's a couple of things. Maybe I'll let you respond to anything you want in that mixed bag of things there, and then I'll turn to the audience and start fielding their questions.
Okay, I mean, I'll try and be quick on these. I mean, certainly I think in Germany, you see the moment that Chinese company tries to take over KUKA, robotics is a moment where there is this huge shift that, as you say, it's not just sort of t-shirts and soccer ball. It's an attempt to sort of gain control of a very high end. But there has to be something more to it, right, than this. Because if that had been a Canadian company that had done that, or a Finnish company, there wouldn't have been the same level of. So I think it's predicated on this pre-existing lack of trust about what it is that China's leaders want and what they will do with that technological leadership when they get it. But yeah, so certainly there is investment in high-end, high value added, high technology, does shift perceptions, but I think there is something else behind that too. And I think in some respects, the definition of what is strategic is determined by who's doing the investment, not necessarily the sector itself, right? So I do think that's important. In terms of the American influence, yeah, I mean, it's been huge, but in two different ways, I think. I mean, the ways in which China was being spoken about when Trump was president did, of course, raise question marks about the relationship between the biggest powers and what this means for the global order. And also it made companies think. For the first time, perhaps they weren't thinking so much about how politics in China might affect their business opportunities, but they were thinking about how politics in the United States might have an impact on them. And increasingly now as well, I think people are factoring in, well, you know, if things change in Europe as well, if we're producing in China, can that, will we be able to export to America? Will we face some sort of sanctions back in Europe and the UK as well? So it's having an impact in that direction. But I think when we see the shift from Trump to Biden, it's then the idea of a possibility of some form of value-based alliances become sort of more on the agenda. And there was talk of an Anglosphere, for example, an Anglosphere approach to dealing with China that emerged even before actually Biden had been sworn in. And I think the UK's position on China has always been this sort of, how closely do you want to be seen simply as a lackey of the United States and following the leadership of Washington in the eyes of China, that you need to be seen as being some sort of independent actor, but also that there is a form of strength in numbers, as it were. Policy towards Europe, I think, up and certainly under Osborne, was seen very much as being competitive. But the more China is seen, the less China is seen as an opportunity, and the more that it is seen as a threat. My instinct is that while that competitive instinct will never go away, there is also perhaps more of a focus on, yeah, not avoiding the divide and rule sort of tactics that you were talking about, which I think have been very successful. What else did you say? Oh, the diplomacy. Yeah, no, I think it's really. I mean, I don't think it's intended to. It should perhaps say for internal usage only on some of it, but it has really depicted the. If you are looking for evidence of Chinese intention and of that intention in the future not being beneficial to Europe, UK, the West, the liberal world, then I think Chinese diplomats, or some Chinese diplomats, have provided ample evidence to use. Shall we put it that way and leave it like that and open it up for questions?
Perfect.